Hey James, how you doing?
Hello. Hey, Addy. How are you?
Yeah, really good, thank you. So I guess we'll kick off. We've got a bunch of founders in the chat, and I will field the questions to you, and we'll take it from there. But before we kick off, did you want to introduce yourself and Blackbird really quickly and what you do?
Sounds great. I would love to. Uh, I'll start by introducing Blackbird, the firm. Blackbird is a venture capital fund. We were founded out of Australia a little over a decade ago, but really with the foundational belief that technology companies built from this part of the world could compete on the global stage. Imagine back in 2012 where the technology ecosystem, as it was very nascent at that time. Even in Australia, there were just the likes of Campaign Monitor, the early stages of Atlassian, and Australia at that point in time was a little known competitor in the world of software. New Zealand, very much the same. We had, I think, a fledgling Zero at that point in time, and no real technology ecosystem. And our founders, Rick and Nikki, observed that the best venture capital funds within the ecosystem were the Sequoias and the Accels. It was the big US folk coming over. And as they described it, picking up gold off the ground. The best founders having to work incredibly hard to create their businesses, often bootstrapping them into wild success before any external funding was available. So Rick and Nikki raised the $30 million fund and invested at that point in Canva, Safety Culture, Culture Amp, Zoox, four unicorns in that first fund. It's an incredible vintage. And, I think that the last decade has seen an early thesis centered around Aussie software companies to an expansion in our mandate to invest, as we define it, in the most ambitious founders across the region. We put boots on the ground here in New Zealand a little over 5 years ago. We've now invested two funds within the region. The insight back in 2019, as it was very much the same in Australia. It's like there are incredible founders, happy individuals pursuing their life's work um, but there was a lack of availability of capital, a lack of community, and to some extent, and I'll whisper this, but like a little bit of lack of ambition. I think there are folks who want to change the world, but don't necessarily have those, the canvas or the example companies that demonstrate what wild success truly looks and feels like. But there were the early signals of that. There was Rocket Lab, there was Zero, there are a few of these folks, but like just not enough kind of capital and injection of energy in the space. So we put boots on the ground here, really with the goal of investing in New Zealand's most ambitious entrepreneurs. And that's my job as it is these days. I joined Blackbird 3 years ago. My career before joining Blackbird was, the way I describe it, like a random walk through a bunch of different finance roles. I started in corporate banking, then later stage M&A, then investing in VC funds. I got to do a little bit of co-investing into early stage companies. I was like, oh wow, it's so much more fun talking to founders than it is talking to investors. So why don't I orientate my life around that? I spent the last 3 years with Blackbird. I'm a principal on the team, and we are, a small but mighty team of six here in New Zealand, supported by a team of 60 across Australasia. I think but by the numbers, I think we've got $12 billion of assets under management. We're in the process of raising our sixth vintage of funds, which will give us, hopefully, um, you know, touch wood, cross our fingers, $1 billion of fresh capital to spend on the region over the next 3 years. So, yeah,
Amazing.
maybe I'll pause there, and we can.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to sort of go in any direction that would be useful for the folks in the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for that context, James. I think that's really, really helpful for the community and all the people that have joined in on the live stream. I think we'll go in a few directions. One of the directions will focus on really practical advice to founders that are getting started, that are early in their career. Some practical tips and guidance around like what they can do to increase their odds and what they can do to really set themselves up for success.
Hmm.
But before I dive into that, I just really want to give a quick shout out to the Atom, which is the innovation space here at Victoria. It is right on the ground floor at Rutherford House. If you are a unfunded founder, you are a community ecosystem person that's helping improve the space in Wellington and this region, you are a student entrepreneur or a student founder that wants to get involved, like this is a space for you. You're welcome to come and join, work from the space. We host events like this. and we host events in person. And it's really an opportunity for you to take part in building of the ecosystem that we're trying to do here as well. This isn't just the only event this week. We actually have a founder meetup on Friday tomorrow, and we have those founder meetups every 2 weeks to really start building. When we started those at the start of this year, we had 3 people, and now there's about 30 odd founders coming in
Awesome.
to the mix, which is really, really awesome. So I think everyone is super aligned and trying to make a difference. So awesome. So first question for you, James. If you're a founder, just starting your journey, you had an idea, you're really early stage, what would be the first 5 steps you would take towards building that business?
5 steps. Oh gosh. I think I think I'll answer the question a slightly different way. I think that like always focus on the main thing being the main thing. Customer discovery at the end of the day is like the bread and butter of early founding work from my point of view. And I think like a common failing of very early stage entrepreneurs is being very idea first rather than problem first. One other way of putting that is like product first rather than problem first. All great products solve a problem. Ideally, they solve about like an urgent and important and valuable problem. Those like 3 words are each individually critical in terms of discerning whether the problem that you've chosen to solve is sort of visceral and painful enough. And so I think step one is always like articulating your underlying hypothesis. Normally that would look something like, and I think of this in a 4 Ps framework. One, like who is the persona that you're aiming to sell towards? 2, what is the problem that you're looking to solve for them? 3, what is the promise that you are aiming to make to that customer? And then 4, what is the product that will deliver on that promise and ideally solve that problem for that persona? Tying all of that in one tidy knot.
Yeah.
Ideally, that hypothesis has some sort of like, okay, I want to solve this problem for this person. And so that sets the framework for how you should think about architecting your customer discovery. The thing not to do is say, hey, look at my product. Would you buy it? Does this solve a problem for you? Like, look at this prototype that I've just like built. Instead, I would focus on having like a very large number of conversations with folks who are representative of that persona and doing brass tacks, like early stage customer discovery. That can look something like, hey, what's the number one problem keeping you up at night? Why? Why is it important for you to solve that problem? What are the incentives within your firm for solving that problem? Will you get promoted if you were to solve that problem? It's like you're looking to surface what are the most important, painful, visceral problems that a particular persona is encountering at any given time. And then you can understand how, or you can begin to kind of map that to a product idea. But the flip side of that is when you throw out a prototype or something like that, oftentimes you get like, oh yeah, that would be cool, or that's really interesting. And people are not very good at giving like feedback. And what you might miss is that you're solving the 7th or 8th most important problem for them, and it's never going to translate into conversion. Yeah, 5 step process. I'm not sure if I quite nailed that, but I think step one, and you should always just like revert back to step one at each step, is like focus on customer discovery, be incredibly customer centric, and focus on surfacing problems rather than ideating on solutions first.
Yeah, that's really helpful, James. And as a founder that's made all of those mistakes before, I guess a question would be like, do you have a sense of like what that feels like, right? So like, do you like from the founders that you've talked to that have truly found a problem that's like really painful and really visceral, like, can you tell us a little bit about what people should expect when that is clear and how it feels to be in that position?
Yeah. Uh, it's really fun because like you're really just looking for emotion on the other side. And you know, video I think is important in this context. You're looking for non-verbal cues. Oftentimes, when you like pinpointed something that is super painful, you'll get like and this is why like a large number of conversations are important, so you can cross-reference. Say you've surfaced that like what you think is a really painful problem. You can then start prodding on that with other folks. Like, do you have the same? And you're like, oh, yes. Like, that is the one thing that is like ruining my sleep at the moment. Or it's sort of like, or you'll be like, oh, yeah, but actually this other thing. And so you're just sort of trying to navigate that conversation and set it up so that you can, one, surface fresh insights, ideally not anchor people to a particular outcome, but you're looking for emotion. Like, I think one thing that Kiwi, like one observation of Kiwi founders is sometimes we're a little bit too product centric and not focused enough on what is the emotional value that I'm selling to this underlying customer, particularly because ultimately the markets that you'll need to target, at least in the context of building a venture funded startup, are going to be in the US or at least large offshore markets in any sense. I think what folks undersell is like if you say you work in procurement or legal operations or revenue ops, like implementing a piece of software that delivers huge value to that function can be the making or breaking point in those careers. And so like if you can solve problems that hold this like visceral emotion within a potential functional unit or get someone promoted or deliver huge revenue uplift, like those are the things that make and break careers, and those are the emotional tethers that you're trying to sell toward. So, look them in the eyes, get a sense of whether they're really viscerally responding to what you're pitching, and you'll feel it. I think this is sort of like a misnomer as well with this idea of product market fit. It's it's, pardon my French, it's fucking obvious when you have product market fit, because like, at least in an extreme sense, it's when it's getting absolutely yanked out of your hands and everything is starting to break. Anything before that is not quite it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's really, really helpful. I guess the other part of this, so the problem in like feeling that and being really, really clear that there's a real problem there is something that is, yeah, very interesting in terms of um, founders feeling that and not feeling that. So one of the questions that have come up in the stream is like, so what about problems that are not high priority because they focus on a niche? So what about some of those lower down problems or less priority problems? What are your thoughts on that?
Look, the general advice would be don't do it. Focus on an important problem. I would draw a distinction between something that is niche versus something that sits quite far down the stack rank. Let's like use an example. Say I'm selling into a legal team and an in-house legal team at a corporate. Um, if you don't solve a problem that is within the top one, two, three stack rank, the reality is it's just going to play through in very low conversion and painful sales cycles. And like the reality is you are unlikely to get the level of cut through that will translate into the scale of explosive growth that ultimately venture capitalists are looking to invest towards. I should just like signal that bias up front.
Yeah.
As a venture capitalist, we're aiming to invest in something at the early stage that has the capacity in a reasonably short time period to achieve hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. That is an unreasonable growth journey. But what that means is like the preconditions need to be in place. The why now, the tailwind from a market perspective or the tailwind from a pull perspective needs to be in place.
Mhm.
That generally, by definition, means we want to invest behind companies that are solving urgent and important problems
Yeah.
rather than something that is lower on the stack rank. And this is why like a sense of problem taste is almost as important as a sense of product taste. Niche markets are different, and I think is like an interesting concept to riff on
So,
separately.
for example,
Yep, go
James,
ahead.
like the question they added part two to that, which is like,
hmm
what about in the entertainment, for example? What if the product is for entertainment rather than necessarily solving a problem?
Okay. Yeah. That's super helpful context. I'm going to work off the assumption that this is sort of like consumer centric. My mapping and full disclosure, consumer businesses are hard and fraught with risk within the venture space. There have been a few incredible companies that have found wild success over the last decade, but on average, it hasn't been a super fruitful place to invest a ton of venture dollars over in recent times. I think in the entertainment space, it's a little less about solving problems and much more about delivering fresh, unique, and highly differentiated value to consumers. I really like this, an investor in the US, a guy called Chris Pike, who has, I'll share it in the chat. I don't know if I can, but we'll see. There's this doc here, it's open. It's called Frameworks. And here it goes. And in that doc, he identifies like a whole bunch of underlying precursors that talk about the different ways to consider or interpret the value that a consumer product delivers to the underlying consumer. Not to riff on that word too often. And he talks about these atomic value swaps. And I really like this as a concept because it makes it very clear how to internalize the trade-offs that consumers make when they think about a purchasing decision, or oftentimes when they trade their time or eyeballs or attention, and that is traded off as like an advertising economy or something to that effect. The other piece I really like in there is that he talks about sort of the seven deadly sins are effectively like all of the underlying core motivations for consumers when they're purchasing products. So that's another framework that you can think about when internalizing, like how to think about value, I guess, as distinct from thinking about solving consumer problems. No one thinks about Instagram as solving a discovery problem from a consumer perspective. Instead, they trade entertainment for units of ad attention in some respect. The qualifier, I would say, is like the threshold for great is still, is oftentimes actually much higher because consumer products inherently have higher levels of network effects. So, think about the consumer products that you use, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, etc. These are heavily network products, which are really hard to generate enough kind of like social switching behavior or aggregate enough eyeballs. And so what does a 10x experience look like in that context is still the question that I would be asking myself. Like, what is really fresh and unique? And oftentimes there are, there has to be some sort of underlying why now that unlocks some sort of new, highly differentiated consumer experience. AI is definitely like, it's a throwaway term, but there is like a why now for fresh and different consumer experiences on the back of personalization, on the back of generative consumer experiences. And so it's definitely a space I'm fascinated by, but it's dominated by some really big behemoths who are still innovating at reasonable pace. So it's a high threshold.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're getting a few questions, James, around investment and timing. But before I ask those questions, I actually want to kind of change direction a little bit and just briefly have a chat about speed and velocity, right? So a lot of founders make the mistake, and I've made this mistake, which I've learnt my lesson on, is like speed matters and how quickly you can go through cycles and how quickly you can iterate makes a big difference. Can you touch briefly on speed and why it's important and any input and tips and tricks on that?
Speed is something that we like heavily lever our early investment decisions towards. The reason is every early stage pre-seed investment, let's say, right at the beginning, pre-revenue, maybe a product isn't even built, maybe there's a janky prototype in place. Basically, I think of those companies as hypotheses where we are rapidly trying to learn and iterate in service of proving or disproving core beliefs that lie at the heart of that underlying investment hypothesis or business hypothesis. We can go back to that 4P framework, right? Like we think we're selling to this persona to solve a problem, delivering this promise with this product. And so how can we, using a sort of royal we in this context, set up a bunch of experiments to validate and prove or disprove our hypothesis in that context? Then we're making an investment in dollars, and that provides some form of time budget in terms of proving or disproving that in the hopes of either raising more money down the line or generating enough revenue such that we have sort of satiated our promise and believe we're ready to add more fuel to the fire in terms of accelerating a go-to-market motion. If you think of the dollars are constant, your burn rate is constant, your rate of process and your learning cycles is the differentiator in terms of what you can deliver, how fast you can deliver something. And it's the core determinant on whether you will be successful over that period of sort of fixed period of time. And so velocity, speed of learning is everything. The other thing I'd say is that early stage ventures, we're very focused on investing in founders who we characterize as having a learn it all trait. The reason for that is imagine a team with a founder, two engineers, a designer, maybe one other person, a tight team of five, and then imagine in 7 years' time that is a team of 500 with a sophisticated organization with full stack go-to-market motion, product, eng, customer support. The personal learning journeys of those founders is also an unreasonable expectation. We want you to go from a fledgling, raw, spiky founder across one particular vector into something that more closely resembles a public market CEO in a 7 or 8 year timeline. So how quickly can those individuals learn, grok different elements of the business, demonstrate that they're on the path to building a robust skill set across many vectors, can hire, can fire, can make all of the hard decisions that go along with that accelerated journey, like speed, capacity for learning. These are all the markers of the most successful founders. And it also just goes to like speed is a compounding advantage. Like the more you achieve in 1 year, the further ahead you will be. And so in many ways, we're trying to like prove or disprove the chance that we can build a compounding machine that has a chance to succeed over the course of a decade. And so speed and velocity is everything in that. Practical tips and tricks. I think like hiring is probably the one thing to get really right in this context right at the beginning. In many ways, speed is a function of one, your talent density, and two, the cultural posture of the company. And so, like, do you have missionaries rather than mercenaries at the beginning? Are they fully bought into the vision? Do they want to, for lack of a better term, kill themselves in service of trying to build this business? Is there deep alignment across that early founding team? And do you have folks who can, generate a lot of work output on short periods of time? Because it is all about like cycle time. And so it's less about being in position to go fast. It's much more about who is in the room, how aligned are they, how connected are you in service of this vision, and then do you have sort of the infrastructure in place to go fast? So are you just running fast like a headless chook, or do you have a real sense of what direction you're going in? What are you learning with each step in the way?
Yeah, that's awesome. Actually, can we just zoom into just that specific bit around early team being missionary versus mercenary? I think that's really interesting. Can you speak just quickly more about that, what that means exactly, and what those two types could look like, and what is the normal weighting of a team that you might expect?
And like I'd say it's more goal than necessarily like an expectation. So if you had 100% missionary right at the beginning, that would be amazing. I think like remember the recursive nature of those early hires, because all going well, your first 10 employees will then hire your next 40 employees to some extent. And so the folks that you bring on at the beginning become the thing, like they become the culture across the organization at scale. And so those early days are very culture setting in that regard. How do you select for missionaries rather than mercenaries? In some respects, it's like, can you hire unreasonable talent? So, for example, senior full stack eng at Canva earning 300K a year, early stage startup can pay them 150K. Can I can I convert that person to be willing to come on board with a little bit of equity? Like that is a really good signal that you have convinced someone of your belief system as a founder. And to sort of like filter in some of our investment thinking in that regard, like we love to consider this idea of can the founders that we're investing in magnetize amazing talent, because it goes to their ability to proselytize the vision of the future that they are going to sell to their customers, that they're going to sell to us as investors, that they're going to sell to those early employees. And so
Yeah, that's really helpful.
you'd have to ask better founders than me as to exactly how to do that very effectively. Those are sort of the signals of like, do you have it? And then it's really just like a myopic bar for like keeping the talent density really high. And like what
That makes sense.
one little like heuristic that I actually heard from Mark Zuckerberg the other day is like for those early hires, an easy bar of whether you're keeping the talent threshold high enough is like, would you be happy to work for that person? And that's sort of a question we ask ourselves as investors as well, because that's a nice like easy threshold to consider and internalize when you're thinking about making a hire. Maybe it doesn't matter for like a junior QA or something like that, but for like early senior team members, it's a nice bar.
Yeah, I think that's a great bar actually, because even for a junior QA person, quite often it's the energy that you need for that, right? So like, yeah, I mean we're fortunate that we have a great junior QA person, and I would absolutely work for him. So
There you
that
go.
I think that's a great bar. There's a few questions around investment that are coming up, and I really want to shift direction to that. But just before we do, because I know that the investment side will take up a bunch of time. So before we do that, I think it's kind of along the same topic, is like a lot of founders struggle with whether to get a technical co-founder or get a co-founder in general versus actually hiring the right team. Do you have any thoughts on that before we go into the investment stuff?
Yeah, there are a couple of things to consider in that context. The first thing I'll say is we are not dogmatic, and so we will invest in both solo founded companies and co-founder companies. There is a trade-off, and so the first thing I'd say, and like not being a founder myself, but founding companies is a lonely process. It's hard fucking work. The way I describe it to people when they're making the decision to jump in, it's like a lot of bashing your head against a wall, chewing glass. Those are the visceral feelings of what it um, can look like right at the beginning of building a company and figuring out a path to product market fit. Going through that alone and not having anyone who is a true consigliere in that context um, is really hard. And so like the most valuable aspect in many respects of having a co-founder is someone who is there with you, similarly bought in. It's an emotional counterpoint to the process and someone that you can really rely on when times are tough to like feed off one another's energy, because oftentimes that's what it takes right at the beginning. Second point is probably access to talent. And so you can think of like co-founding relationships as being in the same boat from a sweat equity point of view. Co-founders are much more likely to have higher levels of buy-in. And so to some extent, it's easy to acquire, or it's easier to acquire is probably too callous a word, but it's easier to win talent that may not join as an employee as a co-founder from a technical perspective, because they are just going to be more intrinsically aligned to the mission. That being said, and the advantage in that context, of course, when you have a technical co-founder is that you can actually build and ship. If you are non-technical, ideas kind of a commercial leader in that context, how are you going to prove or disprove the hypothesis in terms of actually building the product, putting it in the hands of customers? That is ideally what a great technical co-founder can drive forward right at the beginning. You can, of course, hire the team. And so I would say there is if you looked back 4 years ago or something, really 2 years ago, before the advent of some of these AI tools, it was really hard to build a rich enough prototype that you could actually validate or like prove or disprove your idea as a non-technical co-founder from a product build perspective. I think there's a reason to believe that that is not true today with the likes of Cursor, Windsurf, Vercel. You can build rich enough front end experiences with very little technical capability to at least get to a point where you've like proven or disproven the idea or built the internal conviction that you want to fundraise something and then can hire the team in behind that. One aspect I'll say is like for a solo co-founded team, we would normally expect a much higher ESOP sleeve. We can go into the specifics of what ESOP means if necessary, but that basically just means a larger allocation of equity to the broader team because we really rely on that early incentive alignment to make sure that one, you can attract amazing technical talent because that is absolutely critical, and two, to keep them incentivized.
Awesome. Thank you, James. One comment that I want to make, which I think disagree with you a little bit
Mm-hmm.
on, is the co-founder, getting a co-founder for the sake of loneliness. I think fundamentally as a founder, it is a lonely journey. And the reason that I disagree with you on that is that, like, logically speaking, let's say you get a co-founder in and they're technical, your business, right? Or your marketing and they're a different area, whatever the split might be.
Mm-hmm.
As time goes on, the functions that you are providing in the business and that you're leading end up being quite significantly different over time to that person anyway. So while from an equity perspective and from being in the shared same boat, it might be the same, in reality, the experiences start diverging pretty quickly. And having experienced that in the past, I would strongly urge is that not be the reason that you bring on a technical or any other kind of co-founder into the business because you want someone along that journey with you. Because I do think it fundamentally can be and will be lonely, at least in parts, if not always.
It's a totally valid point, and like the role of founder CEO is always more lonely than technical CEO just by its nature. Right, someone just walked in, so I'll jump into the booth. That being said, I think a layer that I would add to this conversation is like one of the core reasons startups fail is because of co-founder breakups as well. And so the threshold for going into something like this needs to be incredibly high either way. And so it's not like I would never encourage like one choosing to get a co-founder just on the basis of loneliness. It's just an observation that that is true, and these relationships can make it easier over time. Two, like the first thing at the stack rank is always like, can I imagine working with this person for 10 years? have we really built a level of intrinsic trust that this is a relationship that I, believe in? And three, can they go on the unreasonable learning journey that you hope to as the founding CEO as well?
Yeah, that's awesome. All right. Investment talk time. I know there's been a lot of folks waiting for that, so I'll tick into it. I think we'll have to probably be a little bit more quick fire, just given the time on some of these questions.
You
But
bet.
I guess um, if we start from the top, when do you think is the right time for a startup to reach out to a VC or an investor and start asking for money?
Look, I'll break that question into when is the right time to start talking to investors? There's never really a too early a time to start building relationships with investors who you might like to work with going forward. And the reason for that is I want to invest in lines rather than dots. So say you ship me a pitch deck, you want to raise money right now. I have a few weeks to make a decision. And a lot of that decision is underwriting you as an individual. If I've just met you over the last couple of weeks, I have to make like reasonably instinctual bets. If I meet you 5 months prior and can observe like an amazing amount of progress over that period of time, then I'm more likely to make a positive decision in that context. And so I would say, like, first part, never too early to reach out, begin building relationships. We're always excited to meet potential founders right at the earliest of stages. Part two, when is the right time to raise capital? Firstly, is like understanding of VCs, like what we're aiming to invest in, and do you believe that the opportunity that you're presenting to us is something that we will get excited about? Two is like you have a deep sense of internal conviction that if you raise a couple of $1 million, you can put that capital to good use and have a good chance at demonstrating enough commercial intent on the other side of that capital raise to propel the business forward and raise further capital at that next step. That sounds a little bit abstract, but I'm looking for internal conviction that is like battle tested across a number of different international customers. I'm looking for um, early team building, a very clear understanding of who you're going to hire, why you're going to hire them. Is this world-class talent, and why is this team the right team to pursue this idea? But at the heart of it, it's like, have you proven and really proven to yourself that this is a direction that could be successful?
Awesome. Thanks, James. And I guess kind of flowing on from that. So some of the examples in the chat are like, okay, what if you've already built a product prototype and it needs further development? What would you consider that? What would you consider the next step to be for a venture like that?
Well, you know, the reality is like we're trying to invest in companies that have the capacity to be unicorns in the most reductive sense. And so we want to believe in this big, beautiful vision at the end of the rainbow. Normally, that vision starts with a wedge. And so if you've built the early instances of a prototype and you're trying to sell that, then I would be looking for early signals of probably one of two things: early signals of revenue. So you've built the right thing that people are excited to pay for and they're willing to part with their money in return for that product experience. Or two, like a really clear set of learnings as a function of shipping that prototype to customers, and like why or why not this, why it worked or why it didn't work. Because ultimately we're funding towards a milestone. Like you will say, I want to pitch this great grand vision. The first step in that journey is this product experience. We have learned from prototype number one that we've missed the mark on these elements. And so this tranche of capital will enable me to hire a team and deliver on this hypothesis and prove or disprove that I'm walking in the right direction in service of this grander vision. That's sort of how I would think about that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's a very, very niche and specific question, but I'm going to ask it anyway in case it helps that founder. So say a business was in need of 100K funding to sign and deliver a big deal or a big transaction, but they're hesitant to give up the equity because the value is likely to increase considerably having done that deal or transaction. What are your thoughts on that? What advice would you give?
Well, it's beautiful chicken and the egg, right? The first question I'd ask is like, will 100K actually get you to closing the customer? What level of conviction do you have in achieving that outcome? Two, I think like we will normally at the early stage when assessing a company look through to early commercial intent, particularly if it's like I'll just like flesh it out. Like if it's an enterprise customer where they're going to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue on the other side, and you're at the contracting stage, or they have very clearly set out that you need, let's just say like SOC 2 or ISO 27100, like those are the blockers in crossing that chasm, then I think we'll price some of that commercial traction into the valuation. The other reality is like for a pre-seed round, valuations are not very tethered to the underlying commercial traction anyway, because there normally isn't any. Ultimately, we're paying well ahead of an actual valuation of the company for an option on its future value. We're trying to build a 15 to 20% ownership position with the hopes that that company can achieve $1 billion outcome at the end of the rainbow, but with the knowledge that there is a high likelihood that that turns to zero. And so I would reframe it and say, like, is 100K the right question, right amount of capital to really prove and resource the company well in terms of serving great milestones? Because the reality is, if you're chasing down one specific customer, it's a high likelihood that it doesn't kind of work out the way that you hope. And so resource yourself for a little bit longer. And two, like, dilution is just a part of the journey and you should be stingy with it. But the question to ask yourself is like, what is the overarching value to you of the founder of that transaction? Like, can you achieve the contract in the absence of funding? If the answer is no, then perhaps it's just, um, you know, uh,
Awesome. That makes sense. I guess a question for me, because we're kind of on the valuation topics now already. New Zealand market is hard. And it's hard because there is a massive range that founders have to deal with in terms of everything from terms to valuations and things like that. One, what are your thoughts on kind of valuations today in New Zealand and where you see that future headed? And then B, do you have any practical advice on how a founder can make sure that not only are they maximizing valuation, but actually they're finding the right investors and how to go about doing that? Because I think that's more important.
great setup. And you're right. I think like early funding rounds are much more about finding your believers and finding great partners who are going to be there across, play a small partner journey over the course of the next decade rather than always optimizing for valuation. My general funding round advice is one, investors are mimetic creatures. So, you can utilize FOMO as a founder very effectively through a fundraising process. It's a very like high social signal space. And so, Blackbird wanting to invest in something in New Zealand carries a lot of social signal. In the US, we carry less social signal. And if Sequoia was to lead you around, then there'd be hundreds of venture firms chomping at the bit to quickly follow on. It is kind of that game. Fundraising is all about getting to your first term sheet and being able to shake folks off the side. And so the first part of that is building a great top of funnel. What that means is like ideally 40 to 50 conversations within a 2 week time period is probably about the right goal for a pre-seed round. That like I would phase that from like the first 20 conversations are with folks that you don't really want to invest in your company, and then the last 30 or the last 10 even are the folks that you are really excited to invest in your company. That way you have sharpened the axe 50 times before you go and have those critical conversations with the investors that you're really excited to partner with. That basically optimizes for competitive tension. It means you're doing diligence all at the same time. You don't get into this stage where you have this staggered investment process where you're doing diligence with fund number one and you've just had a first conversation a month later with fund number 50. You want to constrain that timeline, try and parallelize as much as possible. So I think that ticks off like fundraising approach. Valuations, like the reality is like New Zealand is a little bit cheaper, generally speaking, than the US from a valuation standpoint. We have smaller funds, we have a smaller market, generally speaking, and we don't have the same level of like venture proof points as the US do. If you're a US investor trying to invest in US startups, you can do that with the belief that there will be many unicorns coming out of the US on an annual basis. That's not necessarily true here in New Zealand. We don't have this steady track record of delivering technology unicorns on an annual basis. We are big believers that that future is coming and that there will be an increasing cadence of venture success stories here in New Zealand. But the reality is, like, there is a first principles reason that New Zealand investors should probably pay slightly lower prices because there are less proof points that we can generate venture success stories. That being said, I think the valuations that we offer at pre-seed are pretty fair and not wildly out of market. Pretty typical terms from our perspective is like $2 million on 10 posts, between like 8 and 10 posts for 20 to 25% of the company. The most important number you need to be focused on is how much money you need to really attack and prove or disprove your hypothesis. 20% dilution is pretty standard on a round to round basis. And the reality is, most of us as investors need to achieve that level of ownership to make our portfolio constructions work. The thing to remember as well is like at the end of the day, this whole ecosystem only works if there are enough successful companies that venture investors own enough ownership within to generate great returns to our investors so that they keep putting money back in the space. If we don't make any money, there is no money that will be funneling back into the space because the whole ecosystem relies on returns coming back both to founders in the success case, but also to investors because it needs to prove out that New Zealand is worthy of investment over the long term. All that is to say, like our portfolio construction relies on investing in one unicorn basically per vintage if we own, let's say, 15 to 20% upfront and get diluted down to 5 to 10%. That's like, that's a bold belief. We need to invest in ideally the one company that comes out of New Zealand in any given three-year period and own a fair chunk of that. And so that's why we're very ownership centric. We're thinking about getting to 15 to 20% so that we can, we don't have to believe that this is a decacorn that's sitting inside of the company rather than a unicorn. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's really helpful, James. I guess for a lot of folks here, like you know, a 8 to 10 post at a two is like extremely reasonable terms from a New Zealand context. A lot of folks here have probably heard of like 500,000 at a two or a three. So, do you have any advice on like the kind of the lowest cap you should consider, or like anything below, don't do it because it will not help you set up for success in the future?
There's always a trade-off, right? Like, you pound the pavement, you talk to everyone, the terms that are on the table are, let's just say, K at two post. It's a rough trade-off because you have to say, like, well, do I believe in this? And are these really the only terms that I have at my disposal? And you have to look yourself in the mirror and ultimately make that choice. I can't speak to, the behavior across the balance of the ecosystem. And there are definitely, what are folks I'd put in the bucket of like old school angels who don't really think with our philosophy in terms of what a good cap table looks like at different stages in the business. Look, there's not necessarily terminal damage if you're taking somewhere around the 15 to 20% dilution mark, even if it's at a poor valuation. The tricky thing is like what milestone do you actually achieve with that sleeve of capital? And are you kind of still in a pre-seed space? And so um, there's not like a hard and fast rule here. Definitely don't sell more than 30% of your company up front. And like I think the most important thing I would encourage founders to do is like increase your top of funnel, spend a lot more time preparing for your fundraise, and give yourself the highest chance of success in raising from credible institutional investors up front. Because the more competitive tension that you lever into the process, the more FOMO that you can create, the better the outcome. And you won't be left kind of holding the bag with a K on $1 million post or something like that. At those terms, like it probably just makes sense to bootstrap anyway and figure out a different path rather than selling a big chunk of the business at a poor valuation, particularly if you think you want to get on the venture path.
Awesome. That makes sense. And probably just a final question because we are on time and I think there's some severe weather warnings down in Wellington. So I
Okay.
think the university might close.
Stay safe.
But yeah, the question is like, with Send in particular, we've kind of been flipping the script a little bit where we're sending out these investor updates, we're sharing the story, we're telling what we're doing and kind of keeping those investor updates and investors updated with those conversations, especially when we don't need to raise and we don't foresee that happening until maybe in the future if it makes sense to. Is that something that you would recommend to other founders as well? Or do you feel like that structure of like try and line up as many meetings as possible in a 2 week period and then take it from there? Or is it a bit of both where it's like actually keep everyone updated and then do that quick like focus window later?
Updates are super powerful when used correctly. If you are selling a narrative of compounding um, commercial traction, product velocity, you control the narrative as a founder in that context. One, I will read all of the updates. I have read all of Sen's updates, and so like I'm tracing the story. We'll reach out if I think, hey, there's like a value inflection point here. I've learned enough. I'm keen to invest at this juncture. And I'm sure many of the investors similarly on their update list will think in the same ways. Like one of our founders, Toby at Kiki, was notorious for sending monthly updates. There's a YC company that I track who does weekly updates. Like it just gives you a sense when you're tracing the company over time. It sort of just reiterates that point of like we're investing in lines, not dots. The more information that you share on that journey, the more that I can feel that there is like a groundswell of momentum building in the company, the more excited I am to going to be to invest. It also just lets me like writing is also a very it's a beautiful way of connecting with a way that the founder thinks. And so like often represented through their writing, you get the sense of how they understand their customer, of the strategy that they're building, of the velocity that they're beginning to inculcate in the company. And so all of those things can translate in that context. It's definitely not a binary, but I would encourage to do both, if anything.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Any last comments, James, before we wrap up? Any advice you want to leave people with as we end the recording?
Yeah, it's like customers. Like, don't go into a room and imagine things. Go and battle test your ideas, battle test the problem that you're trying to solve for. Go back to first principles from a customer discovery perspective. Don't hesitate to reach out. Like, investors are always interested in meeting folks. And so wander into people's DMs, find warm intros to investors when it is the right time. Don't take that first meeting and first set of terms and assume that that's the only thing on the table or that you're too early for Blackbird or Icehouse or anyone else in New Zealand. That is not true. We will invest pre-idea, pre-product, pre-revenue right at the beginning. And so put yourself in the best position to succeed. And then, yeah, good luck. My email and DMs and LinkedIn are very open. So hope you all do well and hope to invest in some of you at some point.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, James. Stay on the recording. I'm going to stop it, but it's going to keep uploading. Thank you
Got
for everyone that tuned in. We'll do more of these in the future. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, just send them my way or, drop into the Atom if you're in Wellington. But thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you guys next time.